at me were, cryptocurrency, blockchain, etc. So, or I don't know if there's anything else of interest that you guys would really like to hear about. So I'll just pause for a second to see if Alan or Keisha, if you guys have some thoughts on what you'd like to hear about today.
I am interested in the cryptocurrency because I noticed that's where a lot of attraction is right now, and I think that's where it's going to be later on in the future. So I'm more interested in that.
All right, fair enough.
I agree, because last year they had a session on cryptocurrency too, but it was kind of like hard for me to choose which session I wanted to go to, so I missed that one. So I kind of want to hear about it this year.
All right, fair enough. Well, yeah, I think I actually did that session last year as well. So, but good to hear. So yeah, I'll give some perspectives on that, and then I mean, it's obviously a broad topic. I'll see how much I could cover in the 34 minutes or so that we have. But I guess at the very basic, before you get to the whole concept of cryptocurrency, I think the first thing you want to understand is the concept of a blockchain, because essentially the underlying technology that allows cryptocurrency to exist is this technology that we call blockchain. And essentially what a blockchain is it's essentially a network, if you will, or a series of computers that in effect are storing ledgers on what we would call a distributed ledger. So for example, if you guys are familiar with accounting, you have an accounting ledger which records debits and credits, right? And all distributed ledger is that instead of myself holding the only copy of the information, that information is distributed throughout the network. So if you contrast that with, let's say, a standard bank, if you look at a standard bank, what happens in a standard bank environment is that you will make transactions with the bank, and the bank will then store that information, and the bank is the ultimate source of that information, right? So if you wanted to understand how much money you have or what transactions you've made, you'd have to log on to the bank's website or go into the bank and get access to what the bank has stored as the transactions or what your cash balance is. One of the flaws of something, and that's what we would generally call a centralized network, because there's one individual, in this case, the bank, that controls the information. And one of the flaws of that framework is that if someone were to hack into the bank, because the bank is the sort of authority of what transactions and balances you hold with it, all I needed to do is hack into that bank, and then I would have access to manipulate your information. Where what blockchain sort of came along and said is that in order to record all of these transactions, rather than relying on one central authority, we will distribute the information of all these transactions throughout the network. So if you think of that as an example, imagine that at your school, your school might have 400 or 500 students. And imagine if, and I'll just use some names of the people here. Imagine if Alan had said to everyone, I am recording the fact that I owe Keisha $10. In a centralized environment, what would happen is that would get communicated to the bank, and the bank would record that transaction. And if I was able to now, if I was Alan and I was now saying to myself, you know what, I want to try to undo that transaction, all I would do is then hack into the one single computer or system at the bank and then be able to change that transaction. What blockchain does is it says that the record of the fact that Alan said he owes Keisha $10 is not going to just be stored with one person. It's going to be stored with everyone in the network. So in this example, if you think about your school having 500 students, imagine if Alan had gotten onto, via an email or whatever, and emailed all 500 students, and all 500 students were told that he owes Keisha $10. So now, if he was going to try to erase or change the fact that he had made that statement, he can't just go to one individual that he made that statement to. He would have to try to get at the emails of all 500 people he had emailed his information out to, and then in essence try to change that information. And so that's sort of the concept of a distributed ledger, is that all of the activity, all of the transactions within a certain framework or ecosystem is communicated to a broad range of participants, so that all of them have a copy of the transactions that were communicated. And so then that makes it very difficult for any one person to be able to alter all of that information, because they would have to then go in and alter the information across all the people that have been provided that information. So at its very basic level, that is the sort of concept of a blockchain, of a distributed ledger. And then the blockchain element of it is that this information is communicated using cryptography, so that the information is secure. And so that way then, in addition to the fact that the information is being communicated to everyone within the network, it is also being protected via cryptography. Now, I won't necessarily get into all of the details of the cryptography because it gets fairly complicated, but one way to think about it is, if you imagine a standard like PIN or password, you have, let's say, a 4-digit password of 9 characters, where you can do 0 through 9. The different numbers of combinations that someone would have to hack in order to figure out your password is a function of the length of the password multiplied by the number of characters. So in this example, if you can enter a PIN with 0 to 9, that's 10. And then the 4-digit password is 4. So you would figure out the number of combinations as 10 to the power of 4, right? Which is a fairly large number because it's 10 multiplied 4 times. However, in the context of cryptography used in blockchain, and I'll use Bitcoin as an example. Bitcoin uses a cryptography or hash function that is, they call it SHA-256. And what that ultimately means is that it's a number that has 256 characters in it. And that number is, and in the context of a hash function in Bitcoin, you use computer code. And so for anyone that knows, computer code is binary. Everything is stored as either 0 or 1. So in this scenario, you have 2 possible numbers, which is just 0 or 1, but you have a number overall that is 256 characters in length. So the number of possible passwords out there would be 2 to the power of 256. So anyone that knows math, 2 to the power of 256 is an astronomically large number. And so the point here is that that is what makes the system secure, is the fact that in order for me to try to hack into that system, I would have to guess a number that has 2 to the power of 256 different permutations. So that's sort of the basics. And if you think about it, you can use this ledger to store any kind of information. It is just the fact that the initial use case, we call it, that was used for this sort of arrangement was in fact Bitcoin. And so that's why, the technology is being associated with Bitcoin. But essentially all it is that, and this is really the concept of money, right? There's no real value in Bitcoin beyond the fact that people are willing to use it to buy and sell transactions, buy and settle transactions. So at the end of the day, the value of Bitcoin basically just changes based on how many people are willing to use it as a medium of exchange. And the power behind it is that people trust it because the information is essentially stored all across the system. And again, it's protected. And I've used a very simple example, but when you're talking about a network as large as Bitcoin, literally, you're talking about tens of thousands of computers that all have the information of all of the Bitcoin transactions that have ever happened since Bitcoin was first established. So again, imagine that sort of level of dispersion in terms of how many people are keeping a record of the transactions in Bitcoin. And the reason why they're doing that is that they're trying to ensure that if as Carlton, if I only have 10 Bitcoin, I am not going to be able to sell that 10 Bitcoin to Danae, I hope I'm saying that name right, if I had already sold that or given that 10 Bitcoin to Keisha. And again, the way that's being done is because as someone checks or posts a transaction, so the minute I say that I owe Danae 10 Bitcoin, everyone in the network is going to then try to validate that I have that 10 Bitcoin to give. And they are able to do that because everyone within the network has a copy of the entire history of transactions in Bitcoin since the time that the Bitcoin was created. So if you imagine that there are currently 100,000 computers in the network, all 100,000 of those computers have a record, and they would go back in time. They're obviously using like computing power. They're not doing it manually, but the computing power and the algorithm will go back in time and it will figure out how many transactions I've made with Bitcoin to see if I have the 10 Bitcoin to give. And that is happening across the 100,000 computers. And all 100,000 computers will essentially have to agree that, yes, I have the 10 Bitcoin before that transaction gets validated. Now, again, I'm being very simplistic with it, but that's generally speaking how a blockchain works, and that's generally speaking how Bitcoin works. All Bitcoin does is basically just keep track of all of the transactions in Bitcoin that have ever been made, and it shares it with what people call miners, because those are the people that are seeking to validate those transactions. And so that and essentially, like any currency, because Bitcoin is not pegged to a given currency, like for example, how our Bahamian dollar is pegged to the US dollar, what ultimately then happens is that the more people trade in Bitcoin, the higher the value goes. So years ago, when I had my, when Bitcoin first came out, I had Bitcoin, and I probably had it when it was worth like, $7 or $10 for every US dollar. Right now, I think the last I checked at it, it's as high as $48,000 is for one Bitcoin. So if I had held on my, 10 Bitcoin at the time that I had my little 10 Bitcoin, I would now be able to, and I purchased that 10 Bitcoin for like, let's say $70. I would be able to have taken that Bitcoin I purchased for $70 and received now $480,000, right? Because 10 times 48,000 would be 480,000. So imagine the idea that, with a $70 investment, I would now have been able to return 480,000. Now, that's ultimately what gets a lot of people excited about cryptocurrency, is they see that something like Bitcoin is increasing ever more readily, and so they think that it's a very good investment. Obviously, the flip side to that is that you have many other cryptocurrencies out there that were established and have failed, and so, while it sounds obviously good in theory to be able to have such a huge return on investment, you have to understand that with any investment that offers a chance for great rewards, there's a chance for great downside risk as well, meaning that you could lose your investment. Now, again, Bitcoin is very secure, and right now it's very difficult for somebody to try to hack. But if, for example, Bitcoin were to ever have a massive scandal where people were able to hack it and collect your money or steal money, then that would drive down the value substantially. And one of the benefits of Bitcoin is the fact that once you post a transaction, it is very hard to undo that transaction. But that's also one of the downsides, because if ultimately someone is able to hack into your account and steal your Bitcoin, they ultimately own it. Because in the context of how Bitcoin operates, if I go in and I was able to steal someone's Bitcoin and I transfer it to my what we call my digital wallet, the minute I've made that transfer and somebody on the system has validated, and the 100 computers have validated that I have transferred money from a LAN's wallet to my own, that transaction is now set in stone, and it's almost near impossible to reverse. And so that is also, while it's a benefit because it makes it very hard for people to manipulate or change transactions, it's also a downside because it makes it very hard for anyone to undo a transaction if a transaction was made by mistake, or if a transaction was made because someone's account was hacked. The other element that probably needs to be mentioned is the fact that because Bitcoin is so secure, if the mechanism by which you're maintaining that Bitcoin or cryptocurrency is lost, there's no real recovery function. So like how if you have a password for your computer or your online email, if you lose your password, you can enter in, click on a button that says forgot password. It'll ask you a couple of questions and then it will reset your password. Nothing like that exists in the context of a Bitcoin or most cryptocurrencies. If for whatever reason you lose the password that protects your Bitcoin, it's gone. And that's happened before. There's actually been a famous example where there was an individual that was managing an exchange for cryptocurrency, similar to like a stock exchange, right? Where he was basically managing transactions. And when I say he, I mean his company. He was managing transactions where someone had Bitcoin, but then they wanted to trade Ether, which was another cryptocurrency. So this was an exchange for people to trade cryptocurrencies amongst themselves or convert it into actual, what we call fiat currency, like US dollars or Bahamian dollars or what have you. So we had this huge exchange that had, I think, roughly about $300 million worth of transactions happening on it. And he was also providing safe custody, because if you remember before, I said that a lot of this cryptography is stored in what is in effect a 256 character password. No one's actually trying to remember what their 256 character password is. So a lot of times that is stored on a computer, or some people will store it on a piece of paper or whatever it is. What this guy was doing was that he was taking people's passwords and providing safe storage for it, so that if they ever needed to access the money, they would be able to go to him. He would then be able to take the password from the storage system that he was using, and they would be able to share it. And they thought that that was safe because they felt like, okay, I have an independent person that is keeping track of my passwords. So if I lose the password, I'll be okay. Now, unfortunately, what happened is that this individual was a relatively young man. He actually went on vacation in India. And I think he was doing hiking. He was, going to the Himalayas, whatever else. He unexpectedly died of a heart attack. And unfortunately, he was the only one in this company that had the password to the computer that had all the passwords. And so what ended up happening now is that literally upon his death, you had almost, I would say, $200 or $300 million of cryptocurrency that basically was gone forever, because now he was the only one with the password that had all of this money, and because it's so hard to hack a 256 character password, no one is able to hack into this system to be able to then get access to that money. So literally overnight, again, that was $200 million to $300 million gone. And you now actually have hackers all across the globe that are trying to now hack into the passwords that he kept. And if anyone is able to do so, they will essentially gain access to that money and will be able to transfer it to their account. And again, once they're able to transfer it to their account and the network recognizes that transfer, it is now set in stone. Sorry, I see Alon, you have your hand raised. Feel free to come off of mute and you can ask the question.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, like, how the guy who died, no one could access his passcode to get the funds or whatever. Can like the network host actually go in from the back end and get his password or passcode?
No, because in this scenario, there's no network host. Because remember, the concept of a Bitcoin or cryptocurrency is usually that all the information is stored across the network. And so there's no one person that is in control of the information, except for in this example. And maybe I'll delve into how that happens. Because what we have in a blockchain usually is you have what is known as a private key and a public key. And so normally what will happen is that if you want to give somebody Bitcoin or money, that person will share their public key. And that public key is known to everyone, and anyone can see that person's public key. And so what they will do now is that they will then communicate information using these public keys that, okay, I am going to give somebody 10 Bitcoin. And only if you have the corresponding private key can you unlock that transaction, if you will. So meaning that in order, if you, Alon, send me Bitcoin using my public key, anyone can see that you sent it to me, and that's how the network realizes that you sent me 10 Bitcoin because it's communicated publicly using the public address, but only the person that holds the private key can unlock it. And so that is why it's so important for you to make sure that if you have a private key, you don't share it with anyone, because anyone that has your private key can then unlock your transactions and your cryptocurrency and essentially transfer it to them, to their own key, and then in effect steal it. So that's why you always have this idea of a public-private key pair. And again, when we say a public and private key, those what we're talking about really is a password that is 256 characters long. So you will have a public password that is shared with everyone, and then that private password is what is used to unlock, and it only happens in one direction, meaning that if you know the public key, you have the private key, you can unlock the number using the private key. However, if you have the public key, there's no way for you, or I shouldn't say no way, it's virtually impossible, let's say that. It's virtually impossible for you to figure out what somebody's private key is based on the public key. And that's all because of this whole algorithm, cryptography, that establishes a one-way relationship, meaning that if I have a public key, I can unlock it with the private key, but you cannot unlock the private key by having the public key. But again, in this scenario, what ended up happening is that these individuals had, because they, didn't really want to try to memorize or somehow store the private key themselves, they gave the private key to this individual because they considered him somebody that they could trust. But the problem was that when he died, he was the only one that had all the private keys. So he is the only one that is able to unlock the $180 million or $200 million that these private keys had. And because those private keys are virtually unhackable, no one can now get in and figure out how much money is owed to whom. And so that's sort of the downside of the technology, is that it is so hard to hack into the password or the private key, that if you lose that private key, you've effectively lost all your money.
So,
So sorry, go ahead.
so I was like, okay, you mentioned something about stealing. Can you actually go to jail for stealing someone's Bitcoin? Or
That's a very interesting question that I don't think that has really been settled from a legal perspective. And I would say every jurisdiction is probably different. But I would say the broad concept here is that the purpose of a blockchain is for transactions to be immutable. And by immutable, that means that once a transaction has been agreed by the network participants and posted, it cannot be undone. So if for whatever reason, Alan, if I was able to get your private key, and then I was able to get into what we call your wallet and see that, okay, this private key has 10 Bitcoin, and keep in mind that 10 Bitcoin is worth 480,000 right now. If I was able to get into find your private key and see that you have 10 Bitcoin, what I would then be able to do is I would then be able to use your private key to transfer that Bitcoin to my account. And once the network processes that transaction and changes the Bitcoin from your private key to my private key, for all intents and purposes, that is now a legal transaction. And it is very difficult to unwind that. Now, again, maybe it is a long shot if you could figure out that it was me that did it, and you could prove that in court, there might be some mechanism for me to be held accountable. But by and large, what you're talking about is somebody, let's just use an example. More than likely, if you're sitting in the Bahamas, it's not really somebody in the Bahamas that's going to figure this out or whatever. It's really hackers that are, sitting in, China or India that are going to hack it. And so if they hack it, transfer the money from your private address to their private address. Now, how are you going to go about trying to get to the legal authorities to tell you that they want their money back, or for you to get your money back? Because now you can have to figure out, okay, who was this person in India that did it? Where do they live? And how am I going to now file a legal claim in India because they stole my Bitcoin that I had in my private wallet when I'm based in the Bahamas? So yeah, there might be in theory a way for you to try to get it back. But the point is that the legal mechanism for you to do so is very difficult and very murky. And so more than likely, you've probably lost that money if someone is able to find your private key. And keep in mind, a lot of times they're not really hacking the private key, because again, the private key is 256 characters long, and it's very hard, and in the context of Bitcoin, and it's very hard for somebody to figure out a 256 long password. What's usually happening is that you, Alan, will have a private key. It's too long for you to remember in your head. So you're going to put that private key on your computer, and your computer or email or whatever it is password protected, but that password is like your birthday, or that password is a very simple password. So literally what you have is you have hackers sitting online all day, and they are basically looking for information of people's like passwords. And then once they have the information of your like very simple email password or your very simple 8-character password, because that's a lot easier to hack, right? They will hack into that. And once they're able to hack into that, they will then just open the file that has your private key. So the key here is that they haven't actually hacked the private key. They've just hacked the place that you were storing the private key, and then they're saving that private key to their system and then using that private key to unlock any Bitcoin available. So does that make sense?
it does.
Yeah. So again, if there's nothing else, if you ever try to get involved in all of this, the one thing you must always understand is that you must protect your private key and without running the risk of losing it, because again, once that gets into somebody's hands, that is, they could basically take whatever currency or cryptocurrency is associated with it. So again, and it is, to as someone was saying, it is sort of the wave of the future, because at the end of the day, I think you're probably going to get to a point where cash is no longer physical, because if you think about it, and people don't really think about it, it actually costs money to store physical cash. Like if you were to go to the central bank has huge vaults stocked with Bahamian dollars and US dollars, because our Bahamian dollar has to be pegged to the US dollar. And so it costs money to build something that sophisticated to store this physical cash. It costs money to have the security to protect that physical cash. And so it is actually very costly to have physical cash, as well as it's not necessarily very safe for individuals, meaning that you or I can easily get robbed or what have you. But if you think about it, and one of the reasons why I think, eventually we will move to what we call a cashless society. And I'll use an example of when I was in China, because I was in China actually right as coronavirus was coming out. And they had what they call this app called Alibaba or whatever, or WePay. And essentially what ended up happening is that you would have a QR code. And if I wanted to get a taxi, or if I wanted to get like a little boat ride or ferry ride or whatever, someone would either show me their QR code on their phone, or they would have like a little necklace that had the QR code like printed out and laminated. And all I would have to do in order to make a transaction is I would just have to scan that QR code, and my phone would have, linked to my credit card or my bank account or whatever. I would type in how much money I wanted transferred, and then I would enter my own QR code or ID or whatever it is, and then that money would be transferred. And if you think about it, that was a very safe mechanism for transferring money, because now how are you going to rob somebody if the money is not held physically? And if you did, there's going to be a electronic record, right? Because one of the elements of cash is that if you take someone from cash, there's no real record that you had the cash in the first place. So unless you have witnesses, a camera, whatever, how you prove that someone took the cash from you? But in this digital environment, if the only way that someone will be able to get access to that cash would be to be able to transfer money, have someone transfer money from this place to another place, and at that point now there's a record of that transfer. And so it'll be a little bit easier if you had to go to the authorities and say that someone had stolen your money or hacked into your account to see what that is. Now, obviously, that's a little simple example because you're talking about people that are physically located within the same jurisdiction, unlike the previous example where you're talking about people dispersed across the globe. But the point being that that's a safer environment to conduct business. And it's a cheaper environment to conduct business, because once you set up the blockchain or the system by which that is going to happen, now, yes, you have to manage the cybersecurity risk, but that's still a lot cheaper than just keeping mountains and mountains of cash in a vault somewhere and having a whole infrastructure built around that to protect it. So again, it is something that is coming to the fore, and they're all different types. We've obviously talked about Bitcoin, which that's one where the value of it fluctuates. Within the Bahamas, the central bank has now introduced Sand Dollar, which is also another digital currency, but that's a digital currency that is what we call a stable coin. And by stable coin, what we mean is that the value of the currency is not supposed to change. So normally when you think about Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies where the value is changing, people are investing in that more so from the perspective of trying to treat that as an investment, and hopefully the value goes up and they will be able to buy it for less than what they have to sell it for. So that's more of what we call speculative investment. When you think about a sand dollar, the intent of the sand dollar is really just to replace the physical Bahamian dollar as a medium of exchange, which is why they want to keep the value stable, because you wouldn't want to be transacting in Bahamian dollars where the value is just going all over the place. And the way they keep that stable is that similar to with Bahamian dollars, just like with every physical Bahamian dollar, you have to have an equivalent US dollar in order for it to remain 1-to-1. And that's what the whole exchange control and one of the main functions of the central bank is that they are trying to ensure that if they have $100 billion Bahamian dollars in circulation, they also have close to $1 billion in US in reserve, because then the demand for Bahamian dollars and the supply, et cetera, matches. And what they're doing with the SAN dollar is that they're saying that for every SAN dollar that is created electronically, I will also ensure that I have an equivalent US dollar, because the whole point is for the SAN dollar to remain 1-for-1. So that's a different type of digital currency where you're not using it to speculate or hoping that the value goes up. You're really using it primarily as a medium of exchange and to make it easier for people to transact online and in effect, essentially using your mobile phone. Because I think ultimately that's where we're headed, is a world where effectively most people conduct business using their mobile phone, because, you know, even in a pandemic or whatever it is, most people by and large, you know, keep their cell phone service. And that's largely how most people are conducting transactions online these days, is just using their mobile phone and downloading an app. So I think we're at 3 o'clock here, so I'll pause to see if there, you know, maybe, I don't know if you guys have to run, but if not, I'll pause to see if there's any other sort of questions or things about, you know, anything that I've said or that you guys would like clarity on.
I look like the person. Oh, go ahead, Kashia.
Okay. I think everything you said was pretty clear. I just want to know, like, do you think, all in all, that we should get rid of cash? Like, your personal opinion? Because I feel like sometimes, like, with cash, it's so, like, I wouldn't say a safer route, but it doesn't have like all the rest of like online scamming. But at the same time, like doing transactions online is a bit more convenient. So what is your take on that?
I mean, my personal opinion, and you know, this is again just my personal opinion. I think doing everything online is ultimately going to be the future. Now, what I would say is that I think and this is sort of the purpose of a session like this, I think what we need to do a better job of is making sure that the general public and the people that aren't, you know, heavily into computer science or whatever, understands the technology so that they can understand and manage the risks. Because I think that's probably where more education is needed. But I do think personally that managing things online is going to be the wave of the future. And yes, there are going to be risks out there. There's the risk that someone can hack into your system and steal your money, which is why banks normally will have processes in place where if that were to happen, you would be able to report it and get back. So for example, when I was living in the US, I had my credit card information hacked before, and the credit card just replaced it. I don't know that we're that far there in the Bahamas, because in the US, you have a very sophisticated system where all these big credit card companies or banks or whatever, they have insurance so that if stuff like fraud and stuff happens, they're able to reimburse fairly quickly, because they're going to just file a claim with the insurance company to get that money back. The Bahamas probably needs to get to that point where it's a lot easier to prove that something was hacked, and if so, to just restore and make someone whole. But assuming that that infrastructure does become in place, assuming that the technology and the security is there, then I personally feel like it will make things a lot easier. And one thing I didn't touch on that is also going to be important, bear in mind that blockchain is being used for cryptocurrency, but it's also being used for other things. So for example, because of that security, you could use blockchain to store your digital identity electronically. And so, for example, instead of like road traffic, NIB, inland revenue, each having a version of you in their systems, because those systems don't talk to each other. And so you'll find sometimes where, you know, NIB might have your information correct, but inland revenue got the birthday wrong or what have you. and you have to go walk in physically and get these services. You could use blockchain to store someone's identity digitally. And so instead of me having to go down and stand in a line for 8 hours to get my license renewed, I could simply prove my identity digitally using a blockchain, and then they can then look at that, validate that, and issue my license to me electronically. And then, you know, a policeman stops me, I could just hit a button, and in the app, you'll see what my license is, you'll see what my NIB is, etc. So bear in mind that this technology is not just about cryptocurrency. You could use this technology for any use case in which you have multiple people that need access to the information that you want to store. So there's all sorts of ways you could use this technology. You could use it to prove identity so that you could, do transactions with the government online. You could use it for voting. So instead of having to sit in the line and vote, again, your digital identity will be there, and then you could just communicate your vote digitally, and it'll be protected with this 256-bit password, like everything else. You could use it to sign contracts. So right now we use it in my firm to sign contracts digitally instead of having to physically write a signature, which has been great, especially in an environment in COVID where, you know, you can't just drop something off to be signed, get it signed and picked up, because a lot of people, you know, offices were closed. You could use it for real estate transactions. So one really cool use case, if you imagine, it's very hard for, you know, a lot of people to invest in property, right? Because you have to have huge amounts of cash. One thing that you could do with a blockchain is that you could say that, okay, you could get 1,000 people together to invest in a $500,000 property. And based on how much they've invested, you know, the blockchain or the system can calculate your ownership percentage. So you might have a 1% ownership of this $500,000 building because you can contribute $5,000 instead of having to contribute or find, you know, to get a mortgage for the full $500,000. And then as that building is rented out and rent is paid, instead of having to worry about a human being being honest and calculating the right amount of money to give you, all of that can be done on a blockchain where you set up what's called a smart contract, where the money the minute that rent is paid, the system via an algorithm calculates how much all 1,000 investors are owed, and it just transfers them to their account or gives them the equivalent cryptocurrency or Bitcoin, etc. So that's a way to get a lot of people that can't otherwise afford a $500,000 mortgage by themselves to be able to invest with a group of people, and they don't need to necessarily trust the people that they're investing in, because the system is going to manage that process, and there will be thousands of people across that system, if you use like a system similar to Bitcoin, that are going to validate that information for you, so you don't have to trust one single person. And so that's really the whole point of this whole blockchain and cryptocurrency and all this stuff, is that in light of all the crises that happened, people were starting to not trust their banks that, you know, caused the financial crisis. They were not starting to trust their governments, etc. So this was a mechanism in order to record virtually anything and be comfortable that it would be recorded correctly, because instead of having to trust an individual bank to record this information, or trust an individual lawyer to manage your real estate properly, your transaction will be communicated to thousands upon thousands of people in the network, and there will be a mechanism for those thousands and thousands of people on the network to anonymously agree and validate transactions, so that if one person tried to change the transaction, or even if 100 people tried to change the transaction, that would not be approved, because the other 900 people that have that information would disagree. Because that's the whole point of this whole process, is that whoever you give the power to validate, they have to come to consensus, meaning that they all have to agree that a transaction you said happened actually happened. And so it's much harder for an individual to try to violate that process. Sorry, go ahead, Altavius.
Oh, keep going.
Yes, sorry, Kashia, you had a question?
Well, I just wanted to comment on something he said earlier. This is my last point, by the way. I like how you made the comparison between like the United States and the Bahamas, because I think that kind of speaks to like changing the world and how a lot of countries are like very like underdeveloped and they don't have the technology and stuff to do like cryptocurrency and to really, like you said, like safeguard a lot of these keys and stuff as well. So I think that, well, I want to go to school to study actuarial science, but I think that this whole like cryptocurrency thing is going to be very big in the future, and it's going to be very like relevant in the whole like actuarial field as well, because in doing stuff online, like it's going to be a lot of insurance policies and stuff people are going to have to figure out for doing like this online transaction thing. So I think it was good that you kind of mentioned like the comparison between the Bahamas and the United States, because there are a lot of things people have to consider when in terms of like getting like that blockchain technology and everything to where it needs to be to make this like a countrywide like popularized thing. So I think that in my career field especially, that's we're gonna help like develop that a lot, or play a big part in developing that in the future.
Yeah, and before I get to you, Octavius, I think the one other thing to keep in mind too is that the other big power of this technology is the fact that the founder, who still has never actually been really identified, if you really think about it, he could have used this technology and become the next Mark Zuckerberg or become the next Jeff Bezos, meaning he could have kept the technology to himself, monetized it, and made billions upon billions of dollars. But what he did instead was that he shared that technology with everyone. So while I take your point about undeveloped and undeveloped, keep in mind that anyone can look at the source code of how you develop a blockchain, and anyone can develop their own blockchain. There's actually a site called Ethereum where if you want to, you could go on Ethereum tomorrow or today. And if you know enough about how to design a blockchain, you could design your own blockchain, you could design your own cryptocurrency. And I say that to say that there are places like, particularly like in Africa, where you had a lot of people in Africa that never had bank accounts. Because if you think about how hard, you guys might not know, but when I moved back here, it was a pain trying to get a bank account because of all the information that I had to come up with. But you have people in Africa that, as long as you are able to, put in the work, and quite frankly, you could go online and learn how to code computer science. I mean, obviously you need to have you need to be smart enough to be able to understand it all, but you could literally go online and learn how to code over, some period of time. And so a lot of what is happening in places like Africa is that a lot of people in Africa are not even using bank accounts and stuff now. They've developed these digital solutions, not all of them blockchain, but they have developed these digital solutions where most of the business is being conducted online using their mobile phone. Because one thing that is very prevalent even in undeveloped countries is the fact that people have cell phones. So yes, there is a level of sophistication here, but to me, that is something that is easy to fix as long as people are willing to educate themselves to get the understanding. Because we don't have a lot of natural resources in the Bahamas, but like the one thing that we have that is basically the same as everywhere else in the world is we have human beings with brains. So literally, as long as you have a brain that is willing to learn and that is willing to understand the technology, you could go off and develop your own solution or what have you. I think I'm being told that it's probably time to wrap it up, but Octavius, maybe I'll take your question and then we'll call it a day.
I was just more so asking in terms of advice, because I'm sure that there are several types of blockchain. What blockchain do you use, and what would you recommend for people our age, probably just getting interested?
I would say, rather than worrying about here's what I would say, and I've said it a few times. There's this site called Ethereum, and what that has is that basically has what we call a developer section that essentially allows anyone to download the Ethereum app and develop their own blockchain. And they also have a section called Consensus that allows people to get educated on how you would be able to develop your own blockchain. So I would say first and foremost, before you sort of try to get into any sort of investment or anything like that, if you're somebody that is actually wanting to be on more of the development side of things, I would say that Ethereum and Consensus are good places to go to start developing the understanding and the education
Education of it, yeah.
of it. And then once you have that understanding and education, then you will be able to then make better and more informed decisions as to what blockchains out there make sense, or then you could kind of figure out, hey, is this something that I would want to actually be involved in developing myself? But again, as long as you have an internet connection, the information is out there. So you just need to be able to have that level of commitment and dedication to go out there and find the information that you're going to need that's going to suit your purposes. But I would definitely say the Ethereum blockchain and the Consensus learning education, that is the education arm of it, is good places to start, because again, virtually, as long as you understand it, you could go on those, download an app and start developing. All right, with that said, I think that's sort of the end of the time. So I thank everyone who attended, and I want to thank JA for hosting. I don't know, Junior Achievement, if you have any sort of housekeeping or anything that you'd want to share.
All right, so thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Thank you, student, for being a part of the finance session. I learned one or two things. So, Mr. Cartwright, I will be reaching out to you privately to get more information about cryptocurrency. But for the students that signed up for the next session, the session's getting ready to start. So you can leave this session and go into your next session. Thank you once again.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank